Hey folks, thank you all for joining. Appreciate it. It looks like we have a bunch of people still rolling in, getting set up with audio. So just while we wait for everybody to join in, and I'm not even on the right slide here for our title slide. All right, so there we go. So the topic of today's webinar is going to be how to complete your 2022 risk assessment specific to HIPAA compliance. Okay, so the risk assessment that is required for HIPAA does happen to be the same exact risk assessment that you need to be doing for MACRA MIPS for those of you that are billing Medicare. So there's a couple of things that different dynamics there that we could talk about, but for all intents and purposes, this webinar is going to be all about the risk assessment requirement for HIPAA as well as MACRA MIPS, which is due before the end of the year. All right. A couple of quick housekeeping items just while everybody's getting set up with audio. Number one is that if you have any questions, there is a Q&A box here in the GoToWebinar platform where if there are any questions that you have that come up during the presentation, or even right now, if there are questions that you have that you're hoping to get addressed in this webinar today, go ahead and drop those into the Q&A box because I'll see them as they come in, and that'll allow me to just be aware of what you're hoping to get out of the webinar today so I can make sure that we're addressing those questions as we go through. So please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. But the other thing is that this webinar is recorded. So within about 24 hours after the end of the webinar today, you will get a link in your email to gain access to the recording. So if you want to have it for yourself, if you want to share it with other members in your practice or on your team, you will get access to that shortly after the webinar is over. Usually you get that email within about 24 hours, okay? And then the other thing is if you need other HIPAA related resources, we have tons of free stuff available on our website. You can just go to compliancegroup.com. You could check out our blog, you could check out our HIPAA checklist, free resources. It's all there along with our webinar archive. So feel free to poke around on there if you find that this webinar today is beneficial. There's tons of other stuff that you could have access to. So with all of that said, we're going to start the webinar today just by tossing out a quick poll to the audience members to see just where everybody is at as far as the annual risk analysis is concerned. So on your screens, you're going to see a quick question pop up here asking, have you started your 2022 SRA quite yet? Or a security risk analysis, security risk assessment, lots of different terms for that. So please feel free to go ahead, answer that question. Looks like we have a bunch of answers rolling in. I'll give everybody a second just to hit the right button on there. Looks like we got about 60% voted. We'll give it another 5 seconds. All right, fantastic. So yeah, 82% voted. Let me close this poll. I'll share the results with everybody now so we can take a peek. All right, so interesting. So a lot of you looks like you're actually ahead of the game. You've at least started on your security risk assessment for this year, 43% of you. 36% say you haven't started. And since we going into November, you got 2 more months left for this requirement. So it's definitely crunch time now for those of you that answered no. And then 21% of you said, what's an SRA, which is really good to know. We'll be digging into what even is the security risk analysis requirement of HIPAA, how to get it done, what your options are, and what you need to keep in mind. So I'll go ahead and close those results here now. But for each of you, that just helps me get a gauge on where many of you are at. I'll do my best to position the content of the webinar today around not only for those of you that may have already started, just to give you some tips and tricks for how you can make this easier and what you need to keep in mind as you're finishing it. But then also for those of you that haven't started, where to begin and what even is an SRA, right? What do you need to be doing for that? So we'll be digging into all of that for the purposes of today. Again, if you have any questions, please submit them in that Q&A box. We actually love getting questions. And if I'm not able to answer it on the webinar today, somebody in our team will follow up with you to make sure that those questions get addressed, okay? Now, For those, many of you may or may not know anything about Compliancy Group, so I always like to give a little bit of our history so you know who you're hearing from today. My name is Liam. I'm one of our directors here. I've been with Compliancy Group for about 4.5 years. The expertise, though, that I bring to the table is really not necessarily having to do with myself. It's really the expertise and the history of our company as a whole. Compliancy Group has been around since 2005, and we have really built our business around the idea of simplifying and automating compliance programs, okay? Figuring out ways that we can make this simple, achievable, clearly documented, reportable, easily maintained. We do that using our software, which is called the Guard, okay? It's kind of like having TurboTax or QuickBooks, but for compliance, along with a methodology that we developed over the course of time to assist our clients in getting through this process. The most important thing I can tell you, and that's not even a sales pitch, that's just to say, we've been doing this for a long time, okay? We've got 17 years of history. We have clients in 40 countries, all 50 states, well over 500,000 users on our platform. And in the history of our company, we have never had a client fail a HIPAA audit, investigation, or be fined across the board, okay? And that's just to say, the things and the principles we're going to be talking about today are things that are proven to work. Again, I'm not patting our company on the back. I'm just saying we have a really good track record. So the tips and tricks we're going to be going through today are things that we hope you really could take back to your practice and apply immediately, whether or not you're a client of ours or not, okay? Now, HIPAA in general is unfortunately heavily misunderstood. Okay, and so you'll see some of the different things here, and it's really just that there's a lot of regulatory layers, a lot of different things that have been passed in years prior. You have HIPAA itself, you then have MACRA MIPS under Medicare and the CMS, which is also where the annual security risk analysis requirement comes from. You have the high tech regs, you have the omnibus rule, okay? To start out today, we really just want to dispel the fog, okay? Be crystal clear here on what is HIPAA, what does it require, and specifically then we're going to get dialed into that annual SRA requirement as we go through. But at the very highest of levels, first thing that you need to know is that the highest level requirement of HIPAA is that you have in place what's called an effective compliance program within your business or practice, okay? There are really only two buckets that you could fall into as it concerns HIPAA. Many of you on here might be covered entities, meaning you are medical practices, you're billing insurance, you're treating patients, putting you into that covered entity category. Others of you in the webinar might be business associates, meaning you are working with covered entities and have access to patient information as a result of that. Regardless of whatever it is, okay, the compliance requirements are the same, okay? Everybody has to have an effective compliance program, but the way that the government uses some of this terminology and even the way that the regulation was written is very intentional, okay? And it's intentionally vague because of how broad this can be, okay? So you might be sitting on here as a small practice, and the regulations and these requirements that you need to address are in every way exactly the same as what a large hospital group needs to address. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google fall under HIPAA, and it's the same regulations that apply to them. The requirements don't change, but you can even see with the way that some of this is written, it's all in that word effective, okay? It's an effective compliance program. Because even though everybody has to address the same requirements, everybody has to follow the same expectations, the way that this ultimately plays out within your individual practices, organizations, and businesses will look different because what's effective, let's say, for a large hospital group might be wildly overkill compared to what's effective for a small practice, okay? What's effective for a small practice might be insufficient for a very large group. It doesn't mean that you can ever do less than what the law requires. It just means that it winds up looking a little bit different. So where do you begin with that? Right? So in this idea of an effective compliance program, you have all of these different HIPAA rules, okay, where this kind of breaks down. You have the general privacy rule. You have the omnibus rule, which is where a breach notification and your business associate agreements come from. The security risk analysis requirement of HIPAA is directly falls under the umbrella of the security rule. So that's what we're going to be focusing in on for the purposes of today. But even with this, I'll start by saying that the security rule in and of itself is often misinterpreted to be primarily a technical security requirement, okay? And even the SRA, or the security risk analysis requirement, okay, is often misinterpreted to be a technical assessment only, okay? So, and I'm sorry, my screen keeps getting messed up here. So you'll see security technical audit, okay, having to do with your IT, your devices, things of that nature. You might be working with an IT company that is doing an annual IT audit with you. But if that's all that you are doing, you are missing a very significant component of what the actual security risk analysis requirement entails, because there is also a physical site audit component that's a part of that, and then 3 administrative audits that need to be done each year as part of an annual audit or review of your operations, policies, and procedures. So I'll start by saying this: for those of you that are maybe part of the way through your SRA, if all that you are addressing right now in your annual risk assessment is those technical components, you are really only addressing a third of one of the HIPAA rules, and you're going to be missing out a much bigger picture. Okay, the reason that the government has this more overarching established risk analysis requirement, which consists of not just the technical security assessment, but a full security risk analysis covering administrative and privacy requirements and physical site, is because that is what will ultimately set the tone for the rest of your compliance program, okay? So you'll see over here what we label HIPAA Light, right? If you're doing just a security risk assessment, okay, that is only technical in nature, then what your efforts are isolated down to is security needs, maybe some security policies and trainings, and you implement a lot of things on the IT side. In order to have this big picture, all of the HIPAA annual requirements addressed, it starts with that full security risk analysis, technical, physical, and administrative audits. We're going to dig deeper into what each of those audits entail in just a moment. But like you can see here, just in light of how do you find out what's actually effective for you and your practice, doing that full risk analysis is where you have to begin, okay? Because if you're doing that full assessment, you'll be figuring out where your gaps are, okay? You'll then, HIPAA requires that you document how you are addressing those gaps, but you won't always know until you do that assessment. And if that assessment touches on all of these other areas, you end up implementing all of the needed policies, procedures, training. You'll be tracking those policies, making sure employees are signing off on them. You'll be implementing the necessary business associate agreements with your vendors, incident management protocols. All of that comes together under the umbrella of the annual security risk analysis, okay? So first things first, okay? If you have only done a technical audit in the past that did not touch on those other administrative components, that is something that we highly recommend that you look into for this year, because you could be missing components. Now, an interesting thing that when you look at how, like when we talk about the importance of this requirement, for the annual risk analysis requirement, the reason it's so important is because it is the very first thing that the government would ask you for in the event of an audit or investigation. And you can see some general statistics here concerning auditing, right? So the government audits and investigates lots of organizations every year. The likelihood of you being, let's say, randomly audited for a HIPAA issue, or just randomly audited in general, it's about 1 in 1,000, okay? It's very rare that a practice or a business will just be randomly audited by the OCR. CMS, you can see it's much more common. What usually happens is not that this is something random that just occurs. There is something that kicks it off, and that could be you have a breach. It could be that one of your vendors or your business associates had a breach, and so the government is now investigating you. It could be a random audit, although like we said, it's relatively infrequent. Could also be things like meaningful use, MACRA MIPS failure, okay? Meaning you don't comply with those requirements, and the CMS does conduct HIPAA audits of their own. What's often most likely is whistleblower complaints, either from one of your employees, because if you ever have a disgruntled employee where that relationship goes sideways, it's very common for that to lead to a complaint filed with Health and Human Services, or even patient complaints. That's the number one way that people tend to get on the radar of the OCR for in the event of a HIPAA audit. And the first thing that they're going to ask you for is your risk analysis documentation. Every time, 100% of the time, that is the very first thing that they ask you for. They're going to want to see where were your gaps in that assessment? What remediation plans did you implement? Okay, and if those things are not in alignment, that is then when they move on to a full audit of your entire compliance program, which can result in a corrective action plan and a fine, right? Just by handling this annual security risk analysis requirement and doing it properly every year, you can nip this in the bud and prevent yourself from ever escalating to like an on-site audit with the OCR or a corrective action plan. It allows you to make sure that your documentation is solid right from the beginning, so there's no issues in that front going forward. And to dig a little bit deeper now into what exactly needs to be addressed in that overarching assessment, I'm going to really break this down here, and I'm going to explain each one of these audits, why it's important, and what needs to be covered in it. But I just want to make sure we don't have any questions that have come through to this point in time. Okay, looks like no questions quite yet, so I will continue and proceed here. Okay, so first things first, okay. Of course, the technical auditing requirements is extremely important, okay? So I don't want to downplay that. It just tends to be, a lot of people tend to have the technical assessment requirement covered. They're missing the administrative pieces. In order for you to be satisfying the technical auditing requirement of HIPAA, it has to include an asset and a device audit, meaning you need to be keeping a log of any of the devices within your practice and how are they being protected. Okay, do you have antivirus, anti-malware? Are they encrypted? Are they backed up? Are they monitored, right? All of those sorts of things, you have to have a log of that to be able to show, because in the event that there's a device lost or stolen, if that's not included in your risk analysis documentation, you could be liable in the event of a breach like that, okay? Now, the second thing is an overarching, what's called IT risk analysis. I know that there's a lot of terminology here, which is why we're breaking it down this way. You could think of these as the 6 audits that comprise the overarching security risk analysis, okay? Now, the IT risk analysis or audit specifically is designed to be an overarching assessment of your IT infrastructure, your network, could be your devices, your Wi-Fi, your firewall, how are things being secured and protected. Touches on a lot of different areas. It's very important, but it tends to be a little bit more advanced. So depending on your expertise and your knowledge within the practice, this is an audit that is commonly handled by an outside IT department, or if you have somebody in-house that is familiar and able to go through some of those things, that's a great place to begin as well, okay? Now, the third required assessment for HIPAA is the physical site audit. This is self-explanatory. It'll have you do a physical walk around of the practice, locks on doors, locks on file cabinets, are paper records being left out? How are things being shut off and logged off at the end of the day, right? All of those sorts of things. Do you have an alarm system and a security system? It could even be sprinkler systems, right? Depending on the nature of the building that you're in. That physical site audit is just dealing purely with physical security, making sure that everything is where it needs to be. Now, these administrative audits that you see at the bottom tend to be where people get tripped up, okay? So security standards, very different from the technical audits above. The security standards audit is an audit of your security policies, procedures, and training within the practice, okay? You should have in your HIPAA manual, in your policy manual, very well established security policies concerning how your employees, let's say things like even a work from home policy, if your employees are working from home, they should know and be expected to follow a clear set of security policies to make sure that that data is being protected, whether it's a technical issue or a human error issue. As well as cyber safety training should be a part of that, right? You then have privacy standards auditing. Okay, this is an audit of your privacy policies, procedures, and training. Same thing, making sure that all of your employees are aware and understanding when they can use or disclose somebody's PHI. Okay, and then there's something called high-tech subtitle D. And this is actually an audit of your breach notification policies. It's a confusing name for a relatively simple audit where you are actually doing an annual review and checking your records for what breach notification policies you have in place right now, okay? It's a great place to begin. Now, it's even good to check. A lot of practices don't have breach notification policies. That's something that you'll wanna look into, okay? Now, if you are doing these 6 assessments each year as part of the overarching risk analysis requirement, which breaks down into these 6 audits, it's very difficult to not become compliant, okay? Because you'll know now where your gaps are. You'll know what you need to implement, what the issues were. And as long as you're carefully documenting your gaps and documenting how you plan to address those gaps, that gives you the really foundational documentation that you need in the event of a HIPAA audit, okay? I'm seeing that we had a question come in potentially. So we had a question concerning the security standards audit. Is the security standards / policies different when you want to deal with blockchain and patient medical records? Thank you. So it's a good question and maybe potentially someone outside of my expertise, but I'll say that blockchain as an up and coming technology, okay, even in the regulations itself, right? The regulation itself actually does not even require encryption, at least not in name, okay? What the law states is that you need to do an assessment where you identify your gaps and you then need to make a good faith effort to address those gaps, okay? As long as blockchain is adequately addressing the gaps or the risks identified to your patient records, can absolutely be something that you utilize. Maybe it might not be mentioned by name in these audits, but it could still be something that you implement as a means of addressing a gap that you have. So hope that helps. Now, a couple of just important things to look at. We're going to take a look at a couple of quick case studies here as far as areas where this went wrong. You see a lot of different HIPAA fines that have to do with a lot of different things. You'll see a bunch of them up here. We've seen right of access become a really hot button topic within the last year or two. Often people can get fined for staff training, missing policies, risk analysis, like we'll see in a second, is a big part of that as well. But I want to focus in on just one of these fines before we dial into, so let's say some more, before we unpack it, okay? This is an organization called Cottage Health. And in their case, they were audited by the OCR as a result of a breach. They actually had 2 breaches. One in which one of their servers was left exposed over the internet, was not requiring usernames or passwords to access files. And then a second breach where a misconfigured server exposed HI completely over the internet, even via search engines. Okay, so it was very problematic. In there, when the OCR came knocking, sent them letters that they were being audited, the thing that was ultimately determined in that investigation was they had missing security risk analysis documentation. They had some records of having done a technical audit and assessment, but their records concerning overarching enterprise-wide risk analysis was woefully inadequate, okay? They also failed, even for the audits that had been done, failed to adequately document their remediation efforts. Now, this was a big organization and a big fine. These are often the ones that get published by the OCR, is what you'll see in the case studies and things like that. But let's say we dial this down to trends that are more related to today, okay? And for those of you that are on here more than likely you're in more of the small to mid-sized practice or business category. Roughly 70% of all HIPAA fines levied, period, historically, okay, were related to missing security risk analysis documentation. Like I said before, this is the first thing that the government asks you for, and it also happens to be the #1 thing that organizations get fined for is missing security risk analysis documentation, which is why this is so important. Very different from what we've seen in years prior, where if you go back 2018 and previous, okay, this is not the case, but from 2018, from 2019 through to now in 2022, roughly 60% of all of the HIPAA fines levied are being given to smaller practices, okay? So this is not something that is only relevant to the larger organizations anymore. There's lots of, you'll see dental practices, eye care practices, you'll see behavioral health, therapists, you'll see lots of solo practitioners on some of these lists that are being fined. And even a lot of people think that because of the pandemic that HIPAA enforcement slowed down. 2020 and 2021 were record-breaking years for HIPAA fines, okay? So consecutively, each of those years saw more HIPAA fines than any other year prior in the history of HIPAA compliance, okay? And in general, okay, those are the risks that you face, right? That's why you want to be thinking about this as you go into the end of this year. But also, there's a powerful thing that happens when you start to address and implement some of these requirements the way that they need to be done, okay, which is if you are taking the time to fully assess and address the risks within your practice, implementing the needed policies, the technical protocols, the procedures, the trainings, what ultimately happens is you just have a more effectively run operation, right? Your employees are happier, provide better service, which improves patient loyalty. Statistically speaking, practices that are compliant and secure have on average about 15% higher profitability than ones that don't, because operationally, you're going to be running much more effectively, right? And there's a lot of reasons and thoughts behind that, but there's a tremendous benefits for your practice here as well as risk if it's not being done. So it's a great thing to start looking at now. Hopefully the webinar today was helpful in giving you a little bit of an overview and an understanding as far as what you actually need to be doing. Some key takeaways here. #1, if you're looking for a way to do this independently on your own, the government does have free resources available. I'll be honest, feedback that I've received from other people is that the government resources are somewhat complicated because you need to do all the documentation manually. They just give you like the framework that you need to abide by, okay? The other option is if you're looking for an affordable way to get this done very quickly. Again, our software is designed to be kind of like having TurboTax, but for compliance. We can get you through this assessment very quickly and efficiently. We also automatically address your gaps. We create those remediation plans for you. Our software will provide you with up-to-date policies, trainings for the staff, BAAs, incident management. It's all built in. So if you're looking for, you know, a quicker, easier, more affordable way to get this done, please reach out to us. When you hop off today, you can email me directly. You can also contact info@Compliancy Group. If you have any feedback on the webinar today, we love to get feedback on just what you thought. You can email info@Compliancy Group with that. We'd love to hear it, okay? Positive or negative, whatever it is. So with that said, I'd be happy to address any questions. I'm not seeing any more questions that have come in, so I want to give everybody maybe just a second. If there's anything HIPAA related that you have a question on, happy to tackle it here at the end of the webinar. We usually reserve some time for Q&A at the end. We got some thank yous. Yeah, you're very welcome. Glad I was helpful. All right, folks, so we've got a quiet crowd today, which is surprising. Normally this topic, we get a lot more questions. Hopefully that just means it was clear. If any of you need anything going forward, again, my email is there. You can contact info@Compliancy Group. We'd be happy to help. Just reach out to us, and we appreciate you hopping on the webinar today. I'm sure that a 30-minute webinar on HIPAA compliance is probably not the bright shining star at the top of your day, right? We appreciate you hopping in here. If you need anything, just reach out. Thank you folks for joining. Bye.